Well, Richard Smith, thanks for coming up on the channel. Good to talk to you for the first time in a few months, I believe. It seems like everyone is transitioning away from carnivore, or at least that's what social media will have you believe. They've kind of inflated that message a bit. Have you seen anything about that in recent days, recent weeks?
I have indeed. And Eddie, brilliant to chat again. It's been far too long. You and I recorded a fantastic podcast on my channel going back a number of months ago. So this is well overdue. And I think the second of many. But yes, is the short answer. Um, I think that some of the people in the carnival community have gone absolutely bonkers. And look, we can get into this. I think
Yes.
yeah, it's going to be an interesting show.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I think so as well. And I definitely wanted to have you on for your perspective on this because you've had tremendous success with carnivore and not just with yourself, but with your many clients that you take on and that you consult with. Particularly, this is another reason why I wanted to have you on specifically, particularly in the muscle building aspect, the performance aspect. And in recent weeks, we've seen many people claim that your performance will decrease whenever you're carnivore. Even if you have a really good time with that and really good experience with that in the first year or two, eventually it's on a timer. It's on a, it's a ticking time bomb, basically. It'll go off eventually, and then you'll have to introduce hundreds, apparently, of grams of carbohydrates a day. Not even just like 10 or 20, in which case I wouldn't really be making a big fuss about this. I would be making some claims saying, you still don't need that. But I'd probably be a little less vociferous with my response as compared to the one that I've had recently. So I wanted to get your perspective more tailored towards that realm. But first, what do you think? Besides that, what do you think the biggest reasons are as to why, not just now, but in maybe in previous experiences you've had with clients that you've taken on, why people sort they sort of they sort of have an affinity. They start to develop an affinity towards introducing carbohydrates back into their diet. What's the biggest reason why people talk to you and ask you about whether they should or not? That sort of thing.
Yeah, brilliant question. I think the biggest factor is addiction. Sugar is a drug. It's more addictive than heroin, and that is a fact. We've seen this in numerous studies. It activates and elicits the same pathways as things like cocaine, morphine, heroin, so on and so forth. It literally blocks the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that allows us to make sensible decisions. It elicits serotonin and dopamine responses, which we're hardwired to chase, by the way. As a species,
Mm-hmm.
we are hardwired to chase dopamine and serotonin. And when we don't reach them naturally, which we can get into how we can do that, then we start to elicit a false response, if you like. So we reach for, there's a number of ways we can elicit these responses: procreation or sugar. Procreation, not always our choice, but sugar, super easy, fast, and effective. We reach for that sugar. We have a dopamine bump, but every time we downregulate that receptor, therefore, meaning we need more next time, and we're constantly reaching for more and more sugar all the time, reducing that receptor and its response, and we're stuck in this vicious cycle. But the most carb comes from things like grains, bread, pasta, rice, so on and so forth. And all of these
Mm-hmm.
compounds, these contain things like lectins and phytic acid, which blocks the absorption of many of the cofactors involved with making the neurotransmitters. So our aromatic amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, phenylalanine, go on to create our neurotransmitters. But the cofactors, zinc, iron, magnesium, B3, B6, B9, B12, so on and so forth, these can be blocked by as much as 100% when we co-consume compounds such as lectins and phytates. So by doing so, we elicit these responses and we inhibit the production of these neurotransmitters. This can lead to something called glutamate excitotoxicity, and that will fuel cravings, anxiety, depression, and then for our requirement to reach for more sugar. Now, many of the carnivores that I have seen within our community, they still indulge in certain things. And it's, yes, you can live a carnivore lifestyle and you can still indulge in things. I'm not going to be dogmatic about that. I think if you want to do those things, that's fine. But every time we do this, we consume compounds which downregulates these receptors. And I think another factor that I've noticed is that people will claim that keto, which is a subsection of, so carnivore is a subsection of a ketogenic lifestyle.
Yeah.
We view them as
Yep.
being different things, but look, they are one and the same. It's just a different variation. Now, what people will call a ketogenic lifestyle is a high fat lifestyle, and it's not. It's not a high fat diet. And my argument always against this is, well, how much fat does it take in my diet to enable me to be ketogenic? Zero. That's how fasting works. When I fast, I'm ketogenic. I use this. I don't need to consume. And
Yeah.
you can consume fat. Fat is
Hmm.
fantastic, but I don't believe that we should over consume fat in regards to many people within the community. I think and look, this is very much an incremental approach. And I presented on this at the World Nutrition Summit for Prof. Noakes last weekend. And I showed my journey from gravitating from low carb to dirty keto, standard keto, clean keto, all the way up to animal based, and then becoming, more carnivore, and then towards lion. This was a series of incremental changes for me, and I believe that that's the best approach. By the way, I don't believe that we should jump straight into becoming carnivore. I think there are a series of changes that we can negate the negative effects of the adaptation process. And that's what I recommend with lots of the clients that I work with. There are some people who do, and some people thrive, but it is a lot harder, especially with the change of the gut microbiome, and as the bacteria in the gut changes from Firmicutes, Bacteroidetes, and that shifts towards animal proteins and natural fats. And also, when we look at the reactive oxygen species, so one of the biggest arguments for plant compounds is that they reduce the polyphenols. So polyphenols are compounds that are polyphenolic in structure, which basically means many phenols. It's not something that is created in human biochem, but it can be beneficial. It can be beneficial in the early stages. And the reason is for the hydrogen atoms, which basically will bind to the unpaired electrons and reduce reactive oxygen species.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But for you and I, that is damaging. So as we gravitate deeper into our journey, it's a natural progression. We remove the plant compounds intuitively. We start low carb, keto, we become carnivore. These series of incremental changes. And we do this because we realize that these polyphenols are not actually antioxidants, and now they're causing issues. And the reason for this is that you and I have very low reactive oxygen species, which is important, by the way. Reactive oxygen species isn't the demon that it's made out to be. Same as insulin, same as glucose, same as cortisol. All of these things are essential, but they're essential in the right amount. And if we imagine an upper and lower limit, then that's where they need to be. In a state of what we call insulin resistance, which doesn't exist, by the way. I don't need to get into that with you. Obviously, you understand this, but reactive oxygen species in a normal state is, or in what we class as an insulin resistant state is elevated. So these polyphenols in the early stages can help quench or neutralize this. But for you and I, our reactive oxygen species are where it needs to be. It's produced through the electron transport chain as a signaling molecule, which is very important, but it's where it needs to be. It fluctuates between this upper and lower level. Now, what happens if you and I consume plant compounds is that we cause something called reductive stress. So it's the opposite to oxidative. Now we don't have enough reactive oxygen species. So now plant compounds are damaging. But that's where we're meant to be. We're meant to be in this state. We're not meant to consume plant compounds, in my opinion. There is a caveat to this in regards to seasonal fruit potentially, and we can get into this also. I do believe that fruit may be beneficial certain times of year. Again, we can get into that. But my point to this is we gravitate towards low carb keto lifestyles. We add in these compounds which are damaging, and we can get into a presentation, if you like, that I gave last weekend on things like broccoli and spinach and kale and nuts and seeds, and how damaging these are, and how much it would take to cause death, which is far less than one would believe it or not, far lower than one would believe. These plant compounds, they kill, and they damage DNA, they cause clastogenesis. But for you and I, as you gravitate into this journey, now they become damaging, so we remove them. So I think in the early stages, we do these things, and that's fine. But then people reach carnivore, and then they still may be suffering from these cravings and so on and so forth, and they feel the need to add in sugary compounds or excessively high levels of fat, and that's fine. Fat is our friend. Fat makes up typically maybe 5% of the cells within the body, which is a big portion. 70% being water, 18% protein. But in there lies the answer and the key to this. Protein builds everything within the body, and it predominates within the cells. It makes up 40% of the dry weight of bone. It makes up the majority of every cell in the body minus the water. And the next is fat. But everything we consume in nature that comes with protein comes with fat. So protein supplies us. We consume an egg or a piece of beef or chicken breast with the skin on or salmon. It's always protein and fat. Nature provides us with this perfectly packaged present. But what we do in the early stages is we add lots of fat, which is fine because now we're transitioning and we're teaching the body to burn or to oxidize fat for fuel. We don't actually burn the fat. But Professor Barkay would shout at me if he heard me say that. You know, but we gravitate into this journey. We consume the fat, and that's fine. But I no longer add fats to cooking. I cook the meats in its own juices, and I don't add any fats unless I eat out. And then, if the restaurant wants to cook in something, I'll preference butter, tallow, lard, ghee, or even olive oil. And we can get into that if you like also. But the fat isn't preferenced, in my opinion, providing we're eating an evolutionary appropriate diet. And an evolutionary appropriate diet, in my opinion, is the animal as a whole. Now, that animal contains protein, that animal contains fat, that animal contains fatty cuts of meat, muscle meat, and it contains lean cuts. It contains organ meats, it contains connective tissue, the glycine, the bone marrow, the blood. We would have drunk the blood through an evolutionary period, which we don't do these days, which is very high in the electrolytes. We don't do these things. So in the case of Paul Saladino, for example, preferenced organ meats. Now, we're not designed to consume high levels of organ meats. They're meant to be in proportion of the animal. So when we overconsume the organ meats, now we lead to copper toxicity, for example, and that can lead to downstream deleterious effects. We need to consume the muscle meat and enough glycine to offset the glycine to methionine ratio, which is critically important, because if we overconsume the methionine will use, or glycine will be used to buffer the methionine. And glycine is important for the production of glutathione. It's important for the production of collagen and so on and so forth. So now we're in a state of low glycine. So this affects the glycine to methionine ratio. In other essences, some people may overconsume just the muscle meat and maybe not the organ meats. And I think, all of these things put together, we've got some people consuming lean protein and nothing else. We've got other people over-consuming the fatty cuts and nothing else. We've got people consuming the organ meats and nothing else. And it's like, well, what is evolutionarily appropriate? And we're meant to consume them. We're meant to consume them all. So now this throws in electrolyte imbalance, copper toxicity, overconsumption of fat, underconsumption of fat. And I think all of these things probably encompass everybody within the community recently who has encountered issues for one reason or another. And we can get into these individually if you like, but I think if we follow a true ancestral appropriate lifestyle, it doesn't mean you have to consume the organ meats and all of these other things, but I thrive. And there are benefits to doing so, by the way, particularly if we look back to the methionine glycine ratio or a histamine response or methylation. Many of us methylate slowly. So many of us suffer with MTHFR issues. Some of us are heterozygous and homozygous, which basically means we carry some of these defective MTHFR genes. And if we look at the folate cycle, we obtain folate from the diet, and primarily the best source is monoglutamate, which comes from muscle meats or animal proteins. The polyglutamate comes from plant compounds, and that needs to go through a laborious process in order to make it into the mono. But either way, we consume folate. It goes through a series of steps. It'll go through three processes essentially to become MTHFR, and then it needs to be converted into the active form of folate. And that process involves B3 and B2. Now, B3 and B2, highly abundant in animal proteins, far less in plant compounds. But if you methylate slowly, it's difficult to obtain enough B2, even if you're carnivore. Because if you methylate slowly, the amount of B2 required to speed up that slow methylation is somewhere between 3 to 4 milligrams, which basically, if we are only eating muscle meat, we're going to need to consume maybe 1.5 kilos of muscle meat to maybe 2 kilos of muscle meat each day. And that's a lot, and I eat a lot. But you can obtain this comfortably with a few pieces or slithers of liver, for example, a couple of times a week. And for all of these reasons, I think if we eat a true ancestral appropriate lifestyle and we don't succumb to one of these misconceptions with low fat, high fat, or the other things that we just mentioned, we seem to thrive. But these pockets of people seem to come from one of those camps, I think. But what are your thoughts, Eddie?
Yeah, well, your point about fat is something that I think needs to be emphasized quite a bit, because one of the biggest things that I've been seeing, and not just in recent times, but for the last year or two, more than that really, is this overemphasis on eating not just lots of fat. Because I'll tell you what, my appetite is pretty good at regulating how much fat that I need from my food when it's not butter or something that is a dairy derivative. That was what my main point was going to be, which is there are people that are eating sticks of butter a day, which, look, if you're not having any problems, you keep doing that. That's fine. Like go ahead. But I can only eat fat like straight animal fat whenever it's in the form of butter. And this is very interesting because people will often say, well, dairy's addicting because of the casomorphins in it. And I do believe that that's true. However, what does butter not have hardly at all in there? Beta casomorphins, or casomorphins, because it's usually from the breakdown of casein that you will get these casomorphins. And casein is a protein. And how much protein is really in butter?
Yeah.
And so there's more elements of dairy that are addictive that don't just come down to the the morphine element of it. And I think that that's a big problem as well. People, this was interesting. So I talked to Coach Steven, and I know that you're very familiar with Coach Steven. You do videos with him quite frequently. Where he said something that I've also thought when it comes to weight gain. So this is one of the common things that has been talked about recently is the weight gain, but also weight loss stalling. So maybe not to the degree that they're gaining weight back or something like that, but there's a plateau. Now, number one,
fatty acids.
Yeah. Well, so that's something that he brought up as well. But also, first of all, we have to get out of the way that sometimes a plateau doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. Okay, that sometimes that happens. Many times that happens. The first bit of weight that you lose can happen very quickly. The last bit, not so much. I know people personally that are like this. 55 pounds lost, and there's like 5 or 10 pounds that just stays on for a year. And it's like, well, that doesn't mean to start eating hundreds of grams of carbs a day. Okay, let's not go that far. But the other thing that I am seeing is people, and it makes sense. I mean, it's understandable, but low metabolic rate as a result of undereating. I see this a lot, actually. Undereating is very easy to do on a carnivore diet if you're not used to eating that much animal protein. You're not used to eating that type of diet, is undereating. And
100%.
yeah, and I've noticed in myself as well, if I've ever thought to myself, maybe I'm undereating, a bit, because I start developing problems. Like I start getting really cold in a 70-degree household or something like that. Like, it's like Fahrenheit for any international viewers. Yeah, not Celsius. But what I've noticed is that I can get down a lot more protein, for example, like double the amount of protein if I'm not eating minced meat. That's also something. You want to talk about ancestral consistency. When we ate an animal, we didn't grab every single part of the animal and grind it all up and then have it and I'm not denigrating people that eat minced meat. Like if you do well with that, that's fine. In fact, that's primarily, given my circumstances, that is primarily what I eat. But I'm aware of that, and I know that if I find that I'm developing symptoms that seem to point in the direction of me under eating, I don't eat ground beef anymore. I eat
Yeah.
something else, you know? So that's another thing. I said it one time as sort of a like offhand comment, like, oh yeah, by the way, I seem to just undereat if I'm eating ground beef and stuff. And I got loads of comments saying, oh, I actually didn't put two and two together. I do the exact same thing. Like I can't get that much food down if I'm eating ground beef. And I go, well, maybe there's something there. So what are your thoughts on that too?
100%.
So yeah, overeating fat in the form of like butter and stuff like that, and also undereating food in general can also be a problem. What are your thoughts on that? Have you ever seen that before? And then what are your solutions for people that may actually be developing those problems, that doesn't include, eating maple syrup every day or something like that?
Yeah, 100%. Look, in regards to things like the butter, for example, I mean, again, we mentioned the odd chain fatty acids.
Mhm.
Now, things like butter and cheese and dairy in general contain higher levels of this, but in a normal circumstances, the fatty acids will break down into acetyl-CoA, which will enter the citric acid cycle, and we'll utilize these as ATP, or we'll store or whatever, or it'll go through to ketone production.
Right.
But the issue with
Yeah.
the odd chain fatty acids is that because there's an odd chain left, this breaks down into propionyl CoA, which needs to be
Hmm.
converted into succinyl CoA. And it can go through a number of processes. And one of these is essentially a fat storage process. So when we, from a caloric perspective, which, I don't need to explain to you, a calorie doesn't really exist in the context that we
Right.
believe it to. But
Yeah.
when you consume more of the cream or the milk, the dairy or whatever, we're more likely to store that fat because of this odd chain fatty acid. So if we can gravitate away from, and this is exactly what I do when I want to gain weight. So when I was bodybuilding, for example, and I was going through a bulking phase, I would eat more of the double cream and the butter and the cheese. And cheese worked very well for me for a very, very long time because it's a fantastic source of protein and fat. It's super convenient. And I found it an incredible tool for many, many years, but I had to remove it eventually because the high levels of the calcium. Now, I'd love to get your thoughts on this actually, but calcium, critically important. It's one of 6 compounds that makes up quite literally every cell within the body. So it's very important. But calcium, I believe, in excess, particularly from a supplement form, is damaging. If we look as nature intended at meat and muscle meat, organ meats, for example, it predominates potassium, which is 4 times higher than sodium. Then it drops right down to magnesium and calcium, which sit at roughly an equal ratio. And these are used in the cell as such. And if we overconsume calcium, calcium is excitatory to the muscle. So
Uh-huh.
calcium can cause things like twitching and cramping. And what we tend to do is add the magnesium to offset, which can work. But the key to this for me is removing or reducing the calcium. So
Yes.
a carnivore diet,
Yeah.
we tend to consume lots of eggs. And eggs are fantastic, incredibly nutrient dense. If you can get on with them, brilliant. But for me, they've started to cause issues from these excitatory pathways in the brain, which I'm susceptible to migraine. So I've noticed that the cheese and the eggs are contributing to migraine. So I've had to remove these. Again, this is something that has occurred, further down my journey. So I've removed them now. I've removed the butter, but that for me is critically important for somebody new to this. Cook in your butter, cook in tallow, lard, ghee. Do all of these things, but eat the cheese, eat the eggs, but be mindful that as you gravitate deeper towards the journey, maybe look at swapping the butter from your cooking to tallow, or even beef dripping, or use the fat from the animal itself. We don't need to add lots of fat to coffee, which I've been guilty of doing. I used to make what we know as bulletproof coffee, adding
Hmm.
butter and MCT. I still add MCT. As you know, I make C8 MCT oil and powder by certification, the world's highest purity. I've got some in there. I use it several times throughout the day. And I don't use it for any other purpose other than the benefits of increasing keto production and breaching the blood-brain barrier, because C8 will instantly convert into ketones, whether you were ketogenic or not. It's not storing. It doesn't elicit the bile response. It's sent directly to the liver via the hepatic portal vein. So I don't add butter, but I will use C8 and exogenous ketones. But beyond that, I don't add in any of these compounds. So if you are stalling, then the first thing, and from a keto perspective, this is more likely to be the keto-friendly vegetables, things like bell peppers, tomatoes, things that are high in lectins, which are, because they're low carb, we believe them to be okay. And they are. They're okay in the initial phases, and that's fine. But as you gravitate deeper in the journey, when you plateau, as you say, that may be fine. You may be plateauing because that's where your body wants to be. And I think it's important to maintain that for several weeks before you try to break through that lower limit again. But if you find that you have excess fat and you are ready to break through that plateau, then remove the bell peppers, remove the tomatoes, remove the compounds that are deemed to be keto friendly, that are higher in lectins, because the lectins will bind to insulin receptors and they will still signal the body to store 5 times more fat than that elicitation and action of insulin alone. So lectins, which are found in nuts and seeds, by the way. So even things that are very, very low carb, very high in lectin. Also, nuts and seeds don't contain omega-3s. Contrary to popular belief, they contain ALA. And your
ALA,
body ALA.
yes.
We need EPA and DHA, and that conversion in
Is very, very low.
if
Like
anything at
it's
all.
in the single percentage points. Yeah, it's like 3% I've seen.
Yeah,
It's
at the
really low.
highest. It's
Yeah, yeah.
so we're not going to obtain enough omega-3s from this. And what we are going to obtain also is lots of cyanogenic glycoside or cyanide, hydrocyanic acid. Things like flax seeds, for example, very, very high in cyanogenic glycoside. At the lower end, it's 14 milligrams per 100 grams. At the top end, it's something like 40, which basically means at the highest level, and based on, I think, at a 70 kilogram male, it's 0.5 milligrams per kilogram is at the lower end, which can cause death. So yes, it's right at the lower end, highly unlikely, but still possible. So
it's the idea that that's even in the thing in the first place. Like, do you really want to be doing that?
well, exactly. And look,
Yeah.
the analogy Eddie I quite often use is, because what people will say is, well, look, the poison is in the dose, and that
Right.
makes no sense to me whatsoever. And think of it this way: if I were to give you this, if I were to fill this with rat poison and tell you to drink it, but it's going to kill you, are you going to drink it? Well, the answer is going to
Like,
be
yeah,
no.
no.
You're not going to drink it. What if I reduce the rat poison down to this much? Okay, tiny amount. It's not going to cause death. I'm going to add lots. I'm going to fortify it with vitamins and minerals. I'm
Yes.
going to add in stevia and erythritol. This is your favorite drink. This is the nicest thing you've ever tasted. Okay, are you going to drink it? Well, the answer is going to be no. Yet this is what we do, and people will say, well, a little bit of something that is bad is beneficial because of the hormetic response, and that's why we believe plants to be beneficial, because they elicit NRF2, which can go on to activate NFKB. But basically, we're told that this hormetic response gives us an antioxidant response, but it's caused by an oxidant.
Yes,
It's a
exactly.
pro-oxidant.
That's
It's a
like, well,
pro-oxidant.
exactly. It's like cutting your hand and being like, well, there's an increased concentration of white blood cells that are going towards that area, so it's really good to keep cutting my hand all the time. It's like, no, but they wouldn't be. It's not a net positive. That's the whole point of hormesis, is a net positive. No, you're looking at the positive in isolation, outside of the context of what's actually going on. Yeah, it's positive in relation to a negative to cancel it out. Like, that's what's going on. So
Yeah.
the antioxidant status increasing, well, that very well might be because of the fact that they're oxidizing your tissues, which means that there's a net zero occurring. If anything, it's still a net negative. It's
Yeah.
still a net negative because of all the other things that come along with those things that are oxidizing your tissues. I'm really glad that you brought it up, because I wrote about that in my book, the whole hormesis argument, the whole idea that, well, plants are really good for you because, yes, as much they might provide small stressors to the body, and really this gets into a distinction between stress and distress, because they're really distressing to the body. Hence why I'm about to say this right now. the tiny stressors are looked at as, oh well, they're hormetic because it'll get you, it's like a metaphorical scarring over of the body, like whenever you build muscle or something, whenever you damage the muscle to get a benefit out of it. It's like, well, the difference is that you're actually resulting in a net positive. It's a benefit to the body. You're providing yourself with multiple benefits. Like if someone else is hurt and needs help, you have more muscle in your body to take care of the situation. It prevents if you fall or something, you have an accident, that prevents you from having serious damage that could otherwise have been really damaging, especially when you're older, right? People like Gabrielle Lyon, they talk about this themselves, as one of the reasons why it's important to build muscle. But when you're talking about eating plants, yes, you're damaging the body, and yes, there is a phenotypic adaptation to that to prevent serious damage from being incurred over time, or at least the same amount of damage that you withstood the first time won't be withstood the second time because your body will have adapted to it. But first of all, it's not all of the damage that that gets into your genotypic maximum adaptation point. Doesn't seem to be a full adaptation point, or else we'd be able to eat plants, right? Not like an herbivore is. They're able to eat plants continuously and withstand all of these toxins because they have a genotypic maximum set point, adaptation set point to withstand all of that damage. We don't seem to have that point, and even if we did, it's not a net positive. It's a net zero because it's only to withstand the plant toxins. You're not getting an additional benefit beyond that.
Yeah, and it's a different response. I mean, we talk about hormesis and hormetic responses. Environmental hormesis is very different to molecular. So training or cold water dipping, red light therapy, UV exposure, all of these things are environmental, and plant compounds are molecular. And they basically activate NRF2, nuclear factor erythroid 2 related factor 2. And basically, we elicit this response. This increases glutathione. Glutathione is elevated as an antioxidant, and then through a process of glucuronidation, will bind and remove that from the body. And that's what we perceive to be as an antioxidant effect. But as you say, it's created via a pro-oxidant in the first place. Now, if we look at, and there are benefits to this, by the way, and from a medicinal point of view, and I am a believer that plants are medicines.
Yes.
And I'm a big believer that if it wasn't for medication, I would be dead without question. So plants are medicines, but we take medication when we're sick, which basically means we shouldn't take it when we're not sick. So if we're unwell, then we can take medication. Let's elicit this response, which can be beneficial in the short term, but let's address the root cause. So if I go to the doctor with a headache, the doctor's going to give me a headache tablet. If I go with depression, it's an antidepressant. If I go with inflammation, it's an anti-inflammatory. Well, that's fine, but what are we doing to address the root cause? Well, if I go into the doctor because I've hurt my thumb, well, how have you hurt your thumb? Well, I hit it with a hammer. So the course of action moving forward is don't hit your thumb with a hammer. But this is what we don't do. It's medication after medication. We don't address the root cause. The issue then is this medication, again, as we say, it activates NRF2. Overexpression of NRF2 will eventually elicit NFKB, nuclear factor kappa B, and this leads to a whole host of inflammatory cytokines. And this is damaging to the body. And if we look at other things that activate NRF2, that will elicit the same response. These are things like lead, mercury, arsenic, tobacco smoke, exhaust fumes.
Smoking, yeah.
So, and what I'm saying there is quite literally, if you were to go outside and suck on an exhaust pipe, you would activate and elicit the same response as eating plant compounds. There can't be one situation in which that activation is positive from one and not from another. So that to me is proof positive that these plant compounds are incredibly damaging, fine for medicinal purposes, but we shouldn't be consuming them on a daily basis. They are quite literally damaging to DNA. They cause clastogenesis, and under light microscopy, they literally break our DNA. They're genotoxic, and this is something I presented on last weekend. And we broke some hearts with this because broccoli is deemed to be a ketogenic food. Things like spinach and kale, incredibly toxic to the body. And spinach can kill. Spinach is very high in oxalate.
Spinach is one of the most toxic ones in the space. The most toxic readily available. Yeah. And
it's all of these things which are deemed to be beneficial. Even black pepper. Black pepper blocks phase 2 detoxification in the liver and prevents the body from detoxing. These compounds are incredibly damaging, and I think it's we've just gone down this journey of consuming it's incredibly difficult to unlearn everything that we've been taught from such a young age. Plants are meant to be beneficial. They're meant to be highly nutrient dense. And if we have time, Eddie, I can run through part of what I presented on last weekend, if you like. And I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
I'll pull that up now. You know, when you're talking, and we can get into some of these things because yeah, it's scary how damaging some of these compounds are, and look, and I think it's incredibly disconcerting that many people have fallen into one or more of these pitfalls in regards to being in the wrong camp when it comes to ketogenic and carnivore
Hmm.
lifestyles, and therefore, going down this path of having to put these compounds back in. I'm not against carb, by the way. I'm not anti-carb. I'm not wedded to the word keto or carnivore. I'm into optimal health. I want to be as healthy and as fit as I can be. And it just so happens that carnivore has led me to that place. An ancestral appropriate lifestyle, consuming lots of proteins, animal proteins and natural fats as they come as nature intended. And I'm the healthiest
Hmm.
and fittest that I've ever been. And I want to put carb in, by the way. I want to be that person of think of it from this perspective. If I can eat beef and lamb, fatty cuts, and all these foods that I want to eat every day, and throw in things like berries and honey on a daily basis or whatever else it may be, why wouldn't I want to do that? I want to do it. I'm a sugar
Right,
addict.
right, right, right,
I
right.
want to
Yeah, yeah,
consume these
yeah.
things. But the fact is, and I have tested this extensively, personally, on athletes with clients who always ask, when can I put carb back in? And you always know the second they ask that, you think, we're already on a slippery slope because they're already looking to put the carb back in. Your body does need glucose. Glucose is essential. And
Uh-huh.
I don't need to explain to you, obviously, but we do make glucose via gluconeogenesis, gluco being glucose, neo, and genesis, the creation of, which is almost a reverse glycolysis pathway where we send lactate
Yes.
and pyruvate and we make glucose. And we do this at a high level. The brain and the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, do need glucose, but a very small
Uh-huh.
amount. And if we
Uh-huh.
look at the adaptation and upregulation of things like the monocarboxylate transporters, as we create ketones, we increase the monocarboxylate transporters and the enzymes BDH, ACAT, and SCOT. And we basically increase these over a period of time. So when we're in a low carbohydrate environment for a prolonged period of time, what I'd class as zero for maybe 12 months or longer, we upregulate these pathways. So now we produce ketones at a high level, we transport them at a high level, and we utilize them at a high level. This is why if you and I were to test BHB in the blood, it's probably 0.3, 0.4, maybe even less. It doesn't mean that we're not in a ketogenic state. It just means that we're highly adapted and keto adapted. And what happens when we do this and we upregulate these pathways is the brain will preference as much as 95+% of its energy, minus things like the glutaminergic neurotransmitters. And then the
Yeah.
red blood cells, and there is an argument even that the red blood cells can produce their own glucose, by the way. But even if we look at the basis that they can't, then the amount of glucose that we need is somewhere between like 9 to 40 grams, I think. And in fact, this is on the presentation, and we'll look at this now each day, which is an incredibly low amount, which in teaspoons, I think is somewhere between, is it 3 to like 9 or 10 teaspoons a day? Because we need at any given time we've got 1 teaspoon in the body of
Yeah.
glucose,
Yeah.
but that's constant, and we're obviously
That's
turning that over.
yeah.
So it's anywhere between 3 and I think 9 or 10 off the top of my head, and I do have the figures in there so we can get into this. But we can make 20 plus comfortably through gluconeogenesis, and we can further increase this through physical activity. So when we start to move,
Yep.
we make more. So there is a difference between exogenous glucose and endogenous glucose, and we
Yep.
can make all of the glucose that we need. So when people say that we need
Hmm.
glucose, we do. It is essential, but we can
Hmm.
make all of the glucose that we need. And I think that's we keep coming back to this. We keep coming back to this thing where, well, I need glucose, so I'm gonna eat it, and it's a slippery slope. Um,
Yeah.
there is an argument for fruit, by the way, and we can get into that as we go along. But it's anyway, I'll throw that back to you. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah. So in terms of like the people saying that we require exogenous glucose, from every single inference that we have, that is complete, that is not. If you're going to make an argument that you require exogenous glucose, like let's pretend that we don't know anything and we're just hypothesizing, we have none of the hard inferences. Well, you cannot say that we need it for the cells that require glucose for their function. A lot of people actually have no idea how glucose is required. People think that we have an aerobic requirement for glucose. We have none of that in the body. Not one aerobic requirement. They're all anaerobic. So erythrocytes, they use glycolysis. They use that 10-step process because they don't have mitochondria, precisely because their main purpose is to provide oxygen for other tissues. So if the cells themselves are absorbing lots of oxygen, then there will be a problem. So they don't have mitochondria in them. Your muscle cells, and believe it or not, it's people will say that your muscle cells at higher intensities require glucose. No, at literally every single intensity they require glucose through glycogenolysis, which is also very similar to glycolysis, but it's really more of a beefy version of it. And then same thing with the brain. A lot of people think that the requirement for glucose in the brain, like your neurons require glucose. Actually, neurons themselves, like you said, I mean, 95% of the brain, besides those other parts that do use, like astrocytes, a type of glial cell, they use glucose through glycogenolysis. They require glucose through glycogenolysis, and they provide adjacent neurons with lactate that's produced through that pathway for aerobic, respiration. So that's the lactate shuttle. I'm sure you're familiar with that as well. The oxidative requirement for glucose in the body is zero. That is not true. And if there were actually a requirement for glucose for these cells through anaerobic means, you would see people that aren't consuming it for years on end developing ketoacidosis. And we're talking about within days that would happen. Within one day. And we don't see that at all. So if you're going to say that we require exogenous glucose, you can't say it's for that reason. The one reason that the reason that has more weight than that one, because that one's just complete nonsense, is the balance of the I to G ratio. People think that the idea that Rob Sywes has put this forth a few months ago, and I reacted to this a while back, where he said that on carnivore with no carbohydrates, you're actually going to get too low of insulin, too high of glucagon. So your fasting blood glucose goes up, your HbA1c goes up consequently or subsequently, and this is going to cause higher glycation rate. You're going to get heart disease as a result of this. And my response to this was, well, hold on a minute. Why is a fasting blood glucose level high? Why is a high fasting blood glucose level a problem? And people, as soon as they hear that, they go, well, what the hell are you talking about? Obviously, it's a problem. I go, okay, look, think of me as an idiot right now. I'm asking a stupid question. Why? Tell me why. And they go, well, because you're going to suffer more glycation. And I go, okay, so the higher glycation, the higher glucose level means higher glycation rate. And they go, yeah. And I go, well, fortunately, we have a test that is a very good inference for a higher glycation rate, which is a fructosamine assay of things like your albumin. Albumin primarily, but other proteins of the blood that are at a higher glycated rate. So what you're telling me is that necessarily commensurate with a higher fasting blood glucose level is going to be a higher fructosamine assay. Well, what do you see in these people whenever they get a fructosamine assay, despite the fact that they have a higher fasting blood glucose level as compared to where they were before a carnivore diet? Well, it's often very low. It's lower than if they had taken that test earlier.
Yeah, 100%, because it's based on 3 weeks over a 12-week period. And the reason for this is that the red blood cells live longer because they're healthier. And, we're
So HbA1c value too. Yeah.
So, I mean, and this is the thing in regards to carnivore. And so you've just touched base on one of the things there that we see higher HbA1c, but again, the fructosamine I think is the creme de la creme there, and it's very much context. Yep. Context is very important, because as we gravitate deeper into carnivore, bloods will change. So clinical blood analysis is something that I'm trained in also, and what we see is there's issues with T3. And we see issues with testosterone. And let's think about this logically.
Talk about that, because that was actually what that was on the list. We talked about weight loss and stalling and stuff like that. That was actually the next thing on the list was thyroid. That was a big
Perfect. So look, if we think of, so let's look at T3. So T3 is used in glycolysis. It's used to transport pyruvate to the mitochondrial pyruvate complex. So when we are performing less glycolysis, the requirement for T3 becomes lower. Therefore, we can expect to see lower T3. It just means that the T3 is more efficient, just like insulin is, just like all of these other markers are, and including testosterone also. So what we'll see is when we become ketogenic or carnivore, initially we see reports of people seeing increases in testosterone. And there are possible reasons for this, because testosterone is produced from cholesterol. So cholesterol goes through a series of steps: pregnenolone, progesterone, androstenedione, testosterone, and estrogen, because all estrogen was once testosterone. So
Yes.
we can see an increase in this also. But then testosterone is also used in lipolysis, the breakdown of stored body fat. Well, after a couple of years of being carnivore, we're a lot leaner. So we don't have as much to break down. It's also used in glycolysis, and testosterone is also used in the production of red blood cells, which, as we've just said, lives longer. So testosterone becomes lower. It doesn't mean that we are devoid of testosterone or T3. These things are just performing at a higher capacity. They're performing at a higher rate. They're becoming more efficient. And it is literally as simple as this. These things become more efficient because they're required far less within the body. Look, I came away from bodybuilding 3.5, maybe 4 years ago, and I went into endurance sports. I decided to come away from the endurance sports, and I've recently started lifting weights again, and I'm gaining muscle at like an incredible rate. Like I haven't lifted, you can't see it in the camera, but I haven't lifted for 3.5 years. You want to see me yesterday when I was benching in the gym? I was like, wow, ripped and shredded, and it's like, boof. And he was like, that's just come from nowhere. Yet my testosterone is very low. I'm not having any issues building muscle, not having any issues recovering. And it's because my testosterone is working at a far efficient rate. And if we look at thyroid function, if we look how thyroid is created, it goes through a series of steps. So effectively, we'll use thyroid peroxidase to convert iodide into iodine. So the iodine that we consume is broken down into or converted into iodide, then needs to be reconverted into iodine.
Into iodine.
So we have that within the body. So that's critically important. That conversion is iron dependent. So iodine or iodine, iron dependent, and selenium. So if we look at all these things are found in high quantities in animal proteins, in natural compounds that we consume on the diet. All of these things we obtain in high quantities from maybe organ meats or muscle meat, so on and so forth. So we obtain them. Then if we look at the conversion of T4 to T3, it does take place in the thyroid, but very, very small percentage, maybe 20%. 80% of the conversion is created in the liver, in the muscle, in the kidney, in the intestines. So what does that tell you? Well, we need a healthy liver. What does keto do? Well, it reverses fatty liver. So it improves the liver. Keto improves kidney function. Training on a ketogenic carnivore lifestyle builds muscle. It improves intestinal permeability, because now we're not consuming the lectins and these compounds that are causing that break in the between the enterocytes lining the gut. It's not causing the release of zonulin, which is leading to intestinal permeability.
Yep.
Everything that nature tells us comes back to this way of living. We eat animal proteins and natural fats, and everything else improves. What else affects thyroid? Well, beta-carotene affects thyroid. So if we are to consume plant compounds that contain beta-carotene, which is not vitamin A, by the way,
it's not.
A is retinol.
Retinol.
Which is found in animal proteins. But beta-carotene, it's dangerous to the body if you suffer with hypothyroidism, because the beta carotene is used. So basically, we use the beta carotene in order to convert T4 into T3. So basically, we're reducing this. And it's the conversion of the retinol. So the retinol that we create. So we basically need to make this beta carotene into retinol. And we use T4 to do that. So the beta carotene to retinol uses T4. So now we have less T4 in order to convert into T3. And we've made a small amount of retinol. Now, the double kicker with this is that retinol is then used to convert the T4 into T3. So the reason we've consumed the beta-carotene in the first place for the vitamin A, we're now devoid of vitamin A, and we've just tanked our T4 and any potential creation of T3. And it just doesn't make sense. plant compounds damage the body at every path, every corner we look at. The sulforaphane, the isothiocyanates will compete for absorption of iodine. All of these things cause issues with thyroid problems. So plants are not the answer. And as I said, I mean, we probably won't have time to get into that. We can probably do the presentation another time if you like, Eddie. But it's plant compounds damage the body, and the carnivore lifestyle heals and repairs all of these things. And I think that if we look at why, all of these people have come away from carnivore and incorporated carb again, it's because they're looking probably at numbers. They're looking at their T3. They're looking at their testosterone. They're looking at the HbA1c. They're not, as you rightly say, they're not looking at the fructosamine. They're not looking at the correct markers, and they're not eating a true ancestral appropriate diet. Now, if you notice, a lot of these things have happened during the last few months, and I think there is an argument for this. If we look, coming back to what we mentioned with reactive oxygen species, in an environment with high UV, so a high UV index, this creates melanin. Melanin can neutralize reactive oxygen species. So what that means is in a situation where we're exposed to high UV, we can reduce reactive oxygen species. So if you are sick, this is a positive thing. We want to reduce this. But again, coming back to what I said earlier, if you are carnivore and your reactive oxygen species is where it needs to be within that upper and lower limit, if we quench this, it leads to reductive stress, which is the opposite to oxidative stress. And now we're in the lower limit, which is bad because we do need reactive oxygen species. So my argument would be that fruit is seasonal. So in the UK, for example, it comes into season at the end of the summer for a number of reasons. One, to fatten us up for a cold winter, but we now have central heating and clothing, so we don't need it for that perspective. Right. But in a situation with high UV index, if we quench or neutralize the reactive oxygen species and leads to reductive stress, we consume the fruit to cause reactive oxygen species to put it back into an optimal level. So there is an argument for locally sourced seasonal fruit, and this is why I believe that the countries in the world with higher UV index have fruit all year round. So there is an argument for this. But the requirement is very small. It doesn't mean you eat loads of fruit constantly. I'm talking a very, very small amount. And you may not even have to. But what I've noticed this year is with a number of clients is that they've intuitively put in locally sourced raw honey or the crab apples in their garden or berries, very, very small amount. And this has enabled them to feel and function a little better. Then they've removed them as the weather changes. So there is an argument for that. But I think that when we start to do this can fuel the cravings and activate and elicit these responses. And then...
Right. That's a consequence of living in a time of abundance. That was actually what I was going to get at earlier, which was as much as it is ancestrally consistent, or at least it could be depending on where you are, you always have to be careful with clients that have a past sugar addiction, because it's really like historically in ancestral times when we had encountered that, it would have been, okay, we indulge. And then if we wanted to indulge even more, we couldn't, because that was it.
Yeah.
Nowadays you can just go right next door. I mean, I can go right across the street to the supermarket and buy a bag of fruit and make apple pie if I wanted to. You know what I mean? Like that's the other thing to consider as well. And I know that you consider that as well, because I mean, there's plenty of people. We're designed to be addicted to sugar. Like that's the whole point. Yeah. Like that's the whole point of it. I'm addicted to sugar. We're all sugar addicts. I mean, very rare. I've seen very rare occurrences of people being like, yeah, I have. My dad's one of them. It doesn't matter how much sugar he has. He won't take another bite if you tell him not to, and he won't care about it. It'll be right in front of him. He won't care about it. But it's very rare. Yeah, that's not me at all. That's not me at all. It's very rare. And if anything, I look at that and I go, you're a weirdo, man. That's like, I don't know. That's natural selection would have gotten you out of the gene pool like a few thousand years ago, maybe, if you were like that. But it's it is something to consider, the whole time of abundance thing. But it doesn't change the fact that you very well, yeah, you could be correct. That's something that I haven't even thought about before. But it gets into another discussion. Like this just gets into the main reason. This is my. You've said before. You've said throughout this conversation that your idea of, you'd love to be able to justify adding carbs back in on a scientific basis, but you haven't found that. You haven't found that yet. And I'm the same exact way. Like I've genuinely, I've been like, not because I want to justify sugar addiction, like justify, you know, eating hundreds of grams and getting fat on carbs or something. It's mainly, it's been, okay, here's my position. And as a responsible person, all I try to do every single day is dismantle that position to make sure it's it's as fortitudinous as possible. And so I've been like,
100%.
that's all I do all the time. Is like, okay, here's my position. What could prove that wrong? What is something like, let's steel man every opposition, like every single one. And I've tried, and I will admit, I've gotten close to being like, oh, 10 to 20 grams, that's appropriate, like maybe whatever. But I I held that view for maybe like a month, throughout the time of me, uploading public material. And then afterwards, I actually found more arguments against that. And I was like, no, actually, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Your argument is probably the most convincing I've heard. But even then, does that mean to do it every single day?
Definitely
No.
not.
And like,
So for full disclosure, I don't consume fruit, not even seasonally, but I'm not against it. I can see why through that mechanism that it could be required or beneficial. But at the end of the day, fruit today is not what it once was.
mhm.
And
That's the other, yeah. Yeah.
so there's lots of caveats to this, but I can get on board with a tiny amount of locally sourced either raw honey or seasonal fruit during the height of the summer or in countries with high UV index. But and we're talking a tiny amount. But I don't consume fruit because as I say, I've experimented, I've tried. I just feel like shit when I put sugar in, and I want to put it in every time I've experimented for many years from an athletic performance perspective, optimal health perspective. I want to put it in, and same as you, I'm trying to constantly disprove my own theories.
hmm
It just leads me back to feeling absolutely awful, depressed. I get spots, itchy skin, aches and pains, brain fog. It just does not work for me. If a little bit works for you during the height of the summer and so on and so forth, that's fine. I can get on board with that. But what we're seeing now is not that. We're seeing sugar addiction, and we're seeing people put these compounds back in because I think they've talked themselves into. And look, there's I don't want to name names of this because I get on really well with lots of these people who have said these things. And I really don't want to name names, but I just think consuming too much fat is problematic, and that could lead to the issues that person has and that person has publicly said that they've suffered with problems when they've been tested. And I'm not going to name names and get into these tests, but eating sugary compounds on a regular basis, which these people are known to do, and consuming excessively high levels of fat. Keto is not a high fat diet. Fat is critically important and we
Right.
do need it.
Right.
Low fat also isn't the answer. But it
Right.
comes back to ancestral appropriate. And just circling back, Eddie, really quickly to something that you mentioned earlier in regards to undereating. I'm a big believer that men tend to do best on 1 to 2 meals a day, because we can eat more. Like I'm a bit of a pig. I love my food.
Yep.
I eat
Me
a
too.
lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I haven't eaten yet today. It's 7 p.m. or 7:05 UK. When we end this, I'll be going home and I'll be cooking probably 1.5 kilos of chuck steak, which is very fatty, very high in protein, very high in glycine also. No fat. I won't be adding fats to cooking. I'll be putting a little bit of water in the pan, put the lid on. I'll cook it at a low temperature for maybe 10 to 12 minutes, and it'll be lots and lots of steak. Brilliant. Women can't do this generally. And there are women that I know who can, but generally women come into this, they see the whole fasting thing and they think, well, I'm going to fast because it's really beneficial. Those studies have been done mostly on men. Women can't tend to consume as much in one meal. And for hormonal production, which is another reason why most women tend to put sugar in, especially around that time of the month, it's not the
hmm
sugar. You're not eating enough. You need to eat
Yeah.
more fat. You need to eat more
Yes.
protein. And if you eat 2 to 3 meals, so men, I believe 1 to 2, women, I believe 2 to 3. And I generally recommend around 4 hours for the mTOR reset. 2 to 3 for women, and I think that they can hit their ratios on this basis. Because if we play into the mTOR reset, which typically lasts 3.5 to 4 hours, we can still consume 3 meals as a woman within an 8-hour window, and now we're still having a 16-hour fasted window. So now we're benefiting from the balance between mTOR and AMPK. So now we're benefiting from all of the aspects of this while consuming all of the nutrients. But if a woman tends to consume 1 meal, then they're under eating, they're not consuming enough protein, they're not consuming enough fat. Now they're suffering with hair loss, fatigue, brain fog, hormonal dysfunction, and now they think, well, I need to put carbs back in. And so all of these other confounding factors, I think, need to be looked into. But the fact is, if we live what I believe to be an ancestral appropriate lifestyle, I don't believe there's a requirement for sugar.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. When you talk about ancestral consistent lifestyle, I've formulated basically a very, very, very simple rule to determine whether or not we should be eating something, which is very similar to you, but I go a little deeper, which is we should be eating the way that across our genome, things that we in our genome are genotypically evolved to withstand, not phenotypically. We're talking about our genotype. However, what are the stimuli that have influenced our genotype very broadly across our genome? Everyone has a different genotype, but it's within a very, very, very minimal range, which is why we're 99.99% genetically identical. And if it deviates away from that, and this includes environment too, which is why sometimes we live in a modern world, so there's different things that we can try. You just mentioned, it's a perfect example that I give all the time. One of the main reasons for fruit consumption seasonally is, as you said, the fact that we could fatten up for the winter. But nowadays we have climate controlled environments, so now you don't have to do that. Climate controlled environments you can think of it's a negative in that it's a deviation away from what we evolved to withstand. Not negative in like it's bad. I mean negative like positive would be according to what our genes evolved to withstand genotypically. Negative would be a deviation away from that. So what we've tried to do in society, and I'm not totally against this, depending on what we're talking about, is we've tried to add in other negatives, other deviations away to counteract it. So this is why it's a perfect example. Climate controlled environments, that's a negative. Okay, so now remove the fruit seasonally. That's another negative. That oftentimes can counteract it. Sometimes that's not true. Sometimes two negatives do not make a positive. Two negatives make a bigger negative, which is, I think, where this goes wrong is the pharmaceutical industry. So, okay, you've been eating a bunch of things that deviate away from what you're genotypically evolved to withstand. So now we're going to give you a drug to fix the symptom. Okay, the drug is a negative. The way that you're eating is a negative. That drug is not a negative that's going to cancel out the other one. That's one that's going to exacerbate the issue to the point where you're on 13 different drugs in order to counteract every single side effect that the drugs that you're introducing are actually introducing further. And so it always goes back to that, doesn't it? Like to go back to your ROS production thing. It's very, very interesting how evolutionary biology works. It's very fascinating because ROS, like reactive oxygen species, as the story goes, plants were the first organisms on planet Earth, and oxygen was a byproduct of cellular respiration. No actual organisms used oxygen. And then eventually what happened is mitochondria had to develop in order to use the oxygen for their source of fuel. But oxygen is highly reactive. That's why things go bad and they oxidize. That's what's going on. They're very reactive. And so as a result of that, the mitochondria had to develop their own, or really the organisms that sort of developed around that mitochondria whenever they developed eukaryotic cells was, okay, well, we have to find a way to curtail the damage that we are incurring from the reactive oxygen species. But over time, we don't curtail them completely because oxygen is always going to be reactive. You're always going to produce ROS. So what happens is as a result of the organism forming to larger and larger organisms and also different ones, which is why, there's rhinos and different animals that all still have mitochondria, they all have an ability to curtail ROS, but they still have a certain level of it. And so as a result of these organisms forming and differentiating into different types, it has evolved to actually have a certain amount of ROS damage being incurred. And so if you curtail it to zero, which is what a lot of people try and do, that's actually still a negative. It's a deviation away from what we're evolved to withstand, and you can cause problems. It
100%.
always goes back to that. It's not just ROS, though. It's with glucose, too. It's with a glycation rate. We're designed to actually have a steady glycation rate. You're not designed to have a zero. That's why your HbA1c value will never be 0%.
Yep.
Never. And you don't want it to be 0%. You're supposed to get it to where we're evolved to have it be, according to all of our hardest inferences. And so I think that's actually, I'm really glad that you brought it up, because I think a lot of people fail to realize, like, okay, it's not ancestrally consistent to eat loads of carbohydrates. So they immediately then, like, they believe, they go a step farther and they go, well, therefore we should get the glycation rate down to 0% or something. It's like, no, that's not the best. And that goes right back to that leads right into my final point that I'll add before I pass it back on to you, which is people right now are getting so focused. They're having it's an epidemic of myopia right now, where they're looking at one blood test out of context. The HbA1c value is a perfect example of this, but even fasting blood glucose, as much as I would say that it's a stronger inference on the spectrum than HbA1c, continuous glucose monitoring would be even better than fasting blood glucose, because fasting blood glucose is often derived from a snapshot in time, where you do a finger prick or something like that. The continuous, even then though, it's not enough. Like you can't just look at that and say without a shadow of a doubt, well, that's too high. You're suffering from more glycation. That's really, really bad. You should therefore add carbs back in, because that will raise your insulin more and therefore bring your blood glucose down a little more. And by a little more, I mean a little more. I mean, you're not bringing it down to 40 milligrams a deciliter. That's not what you're doing. You're bringing it down to like from 95 on a carnivore diet to like 85 or 80. The absolute difference between those two is very small.
Yeah.
So and oftentimes what you'll see is, despite that lower fasting blood glucose level, they're suffering from more glycation, especially considering they're spiking their glucose now. They're spiking it, and then it comes back down. That's where all the damage happens. It's like right above 130 milligrams a deciliter. Well, that's where insulin, but beyond the basal level, is secreted in higher concentrations. And it's precisely that's an inference right there that the body goes, oh, yikes. Uh-oh, you passed that threshold. Now we're suffering from damage. So I think it's a problem with looking at blood tests and failing to understand the Hippocratic Oath, which is do no harm. But what does that really mean in practice? What it means many things in practice, but it means things that aren't as obvious and direct. And one that I cite oftentimes, most often, which is what that means implicitly is, if your client or if you yourself are not presenting with an identifiable disease process or presenting with symptoms, you are obligated to not intervene in those circumstances. Don't. Because you might very well be doing more harm than good, as we're seeing right now with the transgressions away from carnivore as a result of this. So I'll pass it back on to you for feedback on that as well.
100%. And look, we mustn't forget that these industries are designed to make money. Statins, for example, and these other compounds are incredibly big earners for pharmaceutical companies. So it's in their best interest. Yeah, if as I said earlier, if I were to go to the doctor with a headache or whatever, the first port of call is medication, not, well, what's your diet like? And I think in there, that's where things are falling down. But it's whenever I consult with clients, which I consult 3 days a week, which is done by Zoom. So I do that all over the world. A client will come to me and they'll show me their blood tests, and there'll be one thing or two things which are out of range. And it's like, well, how do you feel? Well, I feel fantastic, but my doctor wants me to take said medication. And it's like, well, why would you take something when you feel fantastic? Why would you be driven by a number on a screen? And the perfect example for me was cholesterol. When I managed to reverse my insulin resistance, quote unquote, I went from being clinically obese. I lost 107 pounds, reversed all of my, and you know the story. I reversed all of my illnesses, and I felt the best that I'd ever felt. And when I went to the doctor, I was expecting the doctor to be super excited and to say, "Oh my God, this is fantastic. This is like, wow, revolutionary. We need to look at this and study this."
How dare you expect that? How dare you expect that from your doctor?
Do you know what he said to me? Was look, you need to come away from eating this way because the saturated fat is going to clog your arteries and lead to cardiovascular disease, and the red meat is going to cause cancer. And he was like, well, what makes you say that? Well, your cholesterol is through the roof. All of my other markers were what we deemed to be in a normal range, but my cholesterol was elevated. And it's like, well, but I feel the best that I ever felt. And I wasn't trained in nutrition or biochem or epigenetics or anything at that time. I didn't understand blood analysis, but I knew that I'd felt the best that I'd ever felt. And I
Hmm.
came away from that a little bit disconcerted because I was told by a medical profession that I had to change and revert back to the way that made me sick in the first place. And it didn't make sense. And then I went home and my family basically said the same thing. What about your cholesterol? What about the red meat? And I took a decision at that point to continue on my journey despite not understanding cholesterol. And I thought, well, do you know, I'm going to persevere as I am because I feel so good. And there I started to study nutrition and I began to research cholesterol. And lo and behold, we can't live without cholesterol. It's essential for life. It's like it literally makes up every cell in the body. It's essential for cell formation, cell communication, nutrient absorption, transportation, the production of hormones, and it's essential for healing. And then this compound that I was told is damaging to my body actually turns out that it's protective. You know, so that one thing. Now, had I been somebody else and listened to that advice, I would have gone back to eating the way that I did. But I decided to listen to my body and I decided to listen to how I felt. And that's
Hmm.
the biggest piece of advice I can give to people on carnivore. Look, if you're living keto and carnivore and you feel fantastic, you shouldn't be governed by numbers on a screen. Now, if you don't feel fantastic, that's fine. Then maybe we can look into why. But
That's when the numbers should be looked at
and that's
with context. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
100%. Then we can look at the numbers and think, well, maybe this is out. But more
Yeah.
often than not, they're either consuming too much fat or too little fat or too much organ meats and so on and so forth. Or,
Right.
they're not consuming enough connective tissue and not consuming enough of the electrolytes from the connective tissue and from the organ meats and the gristly bits and the gelatin and all of the things that we tend to avoid. The knuckles, all of these things are very high in glycine and other compounds that allow us to make our collagen substances and electrolytes. So there always seems to be a reason why that person isn't thriving. But very, very well, in fact, never have I seen anyone who is devoid of carbohydrate. It's like
Yeah. Yeah.
it,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's never been a carbohydrate deficiency, or a glucose deficiency, because again, the
Hmm.
body makes all of the glucose that we need.
Right. I guess I suppose the final question that I'll ask you, because we've talked about a lot of things today, and it's been very productive, the conversation. But I guess I suppose the final question to ask is, okay, this all like what would you say to people that say, okay, Richard, this all makes sense. Okay, I'm fully convinced that what you're saying is right. This makes more sense than what all these other people are saying. But then why are these people seeming to fix their symptoms whenever they do introduce the carbs back into their diet? What is the mechanism there, or the multitude of mechanisms? Because there's the fallacy of the single cause, right? There's not just one cause to everything, right? What do you think those most relevant ones are, and why do you think these people therefore are getting better from introducing these carbs back in without doing what you're saying to do instead?
Yeah, well, are they getting better? Is the question. I mean, it's if we look coming back to T3 and testosterone, well, if we put the carb back in, then our bodies require more, so we see those levels returning back to normal. If we're feeling fatigued because we're under eating fat, then the carbs are going to give you that energy. They're going to give you that
Hmm.
serotonin and dopamine bump. They're going to make you feel good in the short term. What was the craze that went around recently? Methylene blue. And that can make you feel fantastic. And I don't recommend anybody consume methylene blue, and we can get into that on another call. But then when people take it, well, I feel good. Somebody that I know, a family member, in fact, consuming Monjaro recently, and I've expressed my concerns about taking Monjaro, and it's like, well, it's working. I'm losing weight, and it's like, oh, but you're not seeing what's going on under the hood. You're not seeing the damaging effects that are occurring inside the body. And ultimately, that's what's happening with, with the sugar consumption. We see athletes constantly who consume lots and lots of carbohydrate, and they appear to be fit and healthy because they're setting world records. Most of these are pre-diabetic and diabetic. You're not seeing the
Hmm.
glycation and the negative damage. And what happens with the glycation? So the glucose molecule travels through the body in a cyclical and a linear form. And the
Hmm.
carbon double bond oxygen is where the glycation occurs. And this goes through a
Hmm.
series of steps, an Amadori reaction, which basically leads to an advanced glycation end product. The advanced glycation end product will bind to the RAGE receptor and elicit it will activate two pathways: the NOx pathway, NADPH phagosome oxidase, and NFKB. NFKB we've already discussed, which is highly inflammatory. And the NOx pathway, it lead to increase in reactive oxygen species. It will damage DNA, damage cells, and it will dysregulate your LDL. And this leads to obviously cardiovascular disease. We're not seeing these things on the surface. They're occurring under the hood. They're occurring inside the body,
Right.
and this is what people are not seeing. So look, when we if you and I were to consume a drug now, cocaine, heroin, speed, sugar,
Yeah.
pick your
Yeah.
drug of choice, you would feel good in the short term because again we're eliciting these responses and pathways, eliciting the dopamine, serotonin, and so on. So we feel good, and we see the metrics, as I say, with the T3 and maybe testosterone recovering, and again with women in regards to hormonal issues. But the fact is, you're not doing it right in the first place. You're either over consuming the fat, under consuming the fat, not eating enough protein, not eating enough in total, maybe not consuming enough B2 from the organ meats. There's all of these things. What I would suggest is book a consultation with somebody such as yourself, or me, or Stephen, because we can look at these bloods, we can interpret the bloods in the context of a ketogenic or carnivore lifestyle, and I guarantee that pulling levers will see these positive results. And look, again, and I must reiterate this, I'm not anti-carb. There are clients currently that I am working with that I have put back on carb. I'm not against carb. And the reason for this is because their HPA access is damaged. So this is another reason why many people on carnivore may be suffering with the requirement for glucose or sugar. Hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenals. This is how we produce cortisol. The pituitary produces thyroid hormone. So if the pituitary is damaged, we have dysregulated thyroid. Human growth hormone, it's responsible for cortisol management, particularly triglycerides. So we can see increase in triglycerides. And if we are in a state where we've damaged the pituitary, which occurs through stress, by the way, and there are a number of contributing factors. This modern life, I think, is a huge stressor. I damaged my pituitary from overtraining because I didn't understand how to train in that context. I damaged my pituitary. And what happened to me was that I was no longer able to, my follicle stimulating hormone, my luteinizing hormone, my triglycerides, my cortisol, I was no longer producing cortisol efficiently. And cortisol isn't a stress hormone. It's not the demon it's made out to be. Cortisol is required for gluconeogenesis, at least 80%. The other is around 15%, give or take, of human growth, which also comes from the pituitary, and then the remainder being glucagon. So if I'm no longer producing cortisol, I'm unable to make glucose via gluconeogenesis. So there are clients that I've worked with recently who have suffered with loss, bereavements in the family, excessively high levels of stress from work or overtraining, and they're no longer producing cortisol. And what we've done is we've given them a saliva cortisol test, which tracks their diurnal rhythm, so we can see how the cortisol is being produced at 4 intervals throughout the day. They're no longer producing cortisol. Now they've got a problem because now they're unable to create sufficient amounts of glucose. So what we've done, we've put them on a very small amount of glucose, and then we've healed the pituitary, and now they back off the glucose. So take it from me, someone who is not, I'm not anti-carb, I'm not anti-glucose. Context is critically important,
I,
but
yeah.
when you address the root cause, when you cover all of these bases, your requirement for exogenous carbohydrate is zero.
I'm really glad that you just said that because I think you're the only coach thus far, the only person I've talked to that has basically given an example of how you have done what I've said sugar should be used to do, which is it should be treated as a drug, it should be talked about like a drug, and therefore it does have utility depending on the circumstance. Just like you said with plant medicines. I mean,
Yep.
where do carbohydrates primarily come from? They come from plants. So it's basically the same concept, which is you can use sugar as a drug because as the drug that it is. That's exactly. It doesn't mean because immediately people think, and I'm not innocent of in this regard. I've done the exact same thing. When you come to the conclusion that sugar is a drug, it's like okay, that's a no go. Always, never will I use that. But do we say that about any other drug? Or do we say, oh,
Exactly.
well, it has utility depending on the circumstances? I actually made a video for Coach Peter, Coach Peter's program that I'm affiliated with. I made a video saying, um, I don't remember the exact title, but the concept was about, is it ever appropriate to reintroduce carbs back into your diet? Like, is it ever appropriate? When is it appropriate to use carbohydrates? And I was saying that basically the fundamental idea was if you have past metabolic disturbances or problems that you've developed as a result of the modern world, modern context, or there's something else that's going on that maybe you still would have suffered even outside of the modern world. Um, Now that we have glucose readily available for use, maybe you could use it in those circumstances strategically. So you can get, if the goal is to acquire glucose, maybe don't do it in the form of something that's sweet that would trigger your addiction, but maybe in the form of white rice or something in a starch form. Uh,
100%, which is lectin
then,
free.
yeah, exactly. Like pressure cooked white basmati rice, organic. Like try to get the most innocent, least offensive carbohydrate source. You could use it. The beauty of it as well is if you're using it for glucose production, you don't need that much. You really do not need that much at all.
Exactly.
Like, how much are you really going to damage your metabolism with 20 grams, 30 grams? I mean, I said that the threshold was like absolute maximum, depending on what your circumstances are, like 50 grams. How much are you really going to damage your metabolism if you're using it very like strategically once again, but also very ephemerally, very transiently until you've gotten the root problem fixed. So I'm sure that that's the way that you're employing the drug as well. The drug that sugar is.
100%. Yeah, and yeah, very much so. And look, make no bones, but it is a drug, when consumed from an exogenous source. But again, as you rightly say, I do believe that there are situations in which they are required, but I don't believe they are required for optimal health in a healthy state. And the goal
Yeah.
ultimately is to get to that point. But circling back to the reason that we did the call in the first place, the reasons that these people from the carnivore community are putting these back in, they are completely explainable. And I think if we were able to sit down with them and explain, just as we've done now, so hopefully they'll see this and take that on board. And I see it with clients every day. I work with clients, and again, I'm in this for optimal health, and I do the same as you, Eddie. I'm constantly trying to disprove my own beliefs because I want to consume sugar, but ultimately it's not beneficial when you are optimally healthy. And in fact, it's incredibly damaging. And as much as I want to put it in, I don't believe that it's beneficial when you are living a true ancestral appropriate lifestyle and when you've got to the point where you and I are, where we're completely adapted, not just fat adapted, but keto adapted, which again
Yeah.
comes back to what we mentioned earlier. And I think they're missing a trick. And it's a shame. Maybe they'll circulate back around because what will happen eventually is that these things will start to cause problems. They'll notice that they start to suffer with intestinal permeability, skin conditions.
It's already happened. It's already happened. Man, there were people there was Courtney Luna, very, very prominent influencer. She's in my book as well, and we're friends. We've talked here and there. She has introduced, or a few months ago, before this recent situation has transpired, this recent deviation, carnivore deviation, happened. She bought into that dogma, actually. She bought into the idea that she actually needs the carbohydrates. She reached her best weight that she had ever, like the most aesthetically pleasing weight she had gotten to on carnivore. And it took her a while. Like it was a lot of work and it was a lot of dedication and discipline that was involved in that. And she bought into this idea that she actually would do better with carbohydrates. And she gained 20 pounds.
Yeah.
And even like it was very quick. And it triggered her sugar addiction, which was one of the main contributing factors to that increase in weight. And what ended up happening was, or even to this day, I think from her own admission, she has not gotten back to that weight. She's not gotten back to that ideal, aesthetically pleasing physique, and she's still dealing with that problem. And she was like, listen, I tried it. It didn't work. Maybe it'll work for you, but it didn't work for me. And I, I guess that we can finish off with this. I think that people misinterpret what dogma actually is. Let me give an example, because there's this claim that's being said that carnivores are dogmatic. Saying that you don't eat any carbohydrates is dogmatic. Okay, let me put it to you this way. If I say that this table in front of me exists, and I say that any deviation away from that claim is false, that's not dogmatic. That's just recognizing a truth. Truth itself. If you're going to say that something like that is dogmatic, then you would have to admit that reality itself isn't even an objective phenomenon. No, facts themselves are not something that are even factual. It's all subjective. Everything's just up to interpretation. It's just recognizing that there is an ideal, recognizing that there is something that's a fact, that is a fact, and not everything being an opinion and something that's completely subjective is not dogmatic. And so with that in mind, what I would say is when people say, hey, things work differently for everyone. There's not one size fits all. What I typically say is, depending on what you mean by that, that is true. For example, not everyone does well eating higher fat versus, lower, that in that case, that's true. But it has to be within the confines of what's indicated and what's not. It's all a balance of chaos and order. Like the claim that's typically made, what the typical implication with that claim is, well, some people might do better with eating hundreds of grams of carbs or even a vegan diet. Someone else might do better on a carnivore diet. And I go, no, that's just a basic falsehood when it comes to evolutionary biology. No animal is like that. No animal is like that.
100%. Look, biologically, we're all the same. Now, what you don't see in the wild is a lion or a tiger waking up one day thinking, do you know what? I've had enough of gazelle or zebra. I'm going to eat some berries. It doesn't happen. Now, biologically, we're all the same. Now, what I completely agree. What is different, what may differ between person to person, is the ratio potentially of fats to protein, and that is it. So women, I believe, require slightly higher fat, and generally they don't do it. And some people, if they're suffering with dysregulated hormones, may require more fat. If you're suffering with osteopenia, osteoporosis, you may require higher protein. If you're trying to fight cancer and so on and so forth, then these ratios need to be looked at for those reasons. But ultimately, we're looking at two of the macronutrients. Well, the only two, in my opinion.
Yes.
Fats.
No, not your opinion. By definition. By definition. That's a fact. Yes. Yeah, correct.
I agree.
Yes.
So, and I think that's where the difference is the degree or the level of fats to proteins.
Yeah.
Everything else is, it's all background noise, But yeah, what a fantastic talk.
Yeah, for sure. No, thanks, Richard, again for coming on. This is a really productive conversation. I think this will help a lot of people out. And this is designed really to, if people were on the fence, this is obviously designed to get them off the fence in the right direction. But also, I think that another purpose of this is to reinforce people's already conceived beliefs about this. Like I think there's a lot of people going, no, I know that's not right. More people need to be speaking up against this. Like we need to actually get this message out there. And that was actually the primary reason. I know, but also, yes, there's a lot of confusion that is being sowed now. Like, what am I doing? There's a lot of people that are transgressing now as a result of these influencers at the top, even ones that are despite feeling totally fine, because they're thinking, oh, well, I don't want to end up like that. I need to change now. And so I'm glad that we got all this out of the way. You clearly, know what you're talking about. And it's good to have coaches that actually know what they're talking about, that are speaking up against this and having a public platform provided to them to do exactly that, to spread that message. So again, Richard, thanks for coming on, and I'm sure that we'll stay in touch, and we'll talk soon.
Pleasure as always.